The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to January's webinar, or actually February's webinar. It was supposed to be January, but we had to move it due to inclement weather. The topic of this webinar is to Kickstart 2014, encouraging year-round adoption and engagement of the performance management process. The webinar will be about 50 minutes or so, and then we will leave ample time for Q&A. For those of you that have been here before, thank you for coming back. I'm very excited to see you. And for those that are new, I hope you find this format engaging. What I try to do in each of these cases is look at the clients that we've done business with, the people who sign up for the webinar, and try to present the case study that would best represent the audience, and it's in a format that I hope is engaging for you. What I typically do in this format is talk a little bit about the problem with the case study that I'm presenting, talk about the approach taken by the organization, and then the solution that they ultimately went down the path with. This presentation is being recorded and will be available for download on our website. Usually it's, by the end of the day or the next morning, but we always send an email with a quick link so you can download it, at your leisure. And you can feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation, and usually questions are asked through the question box, but I'm going to hold off answering those questions until the end of the summary. So a little bit about me. My name is Linda Ginac, and I'm the President and CEO of TalentGuard. And I'll share a little bit more about who we are at the end of the presentation. But just a quick note is TalentGuard offers a full suite of talent management applications sold either as an independent application or as a suite. So hopefully you'll want to learn a little bit more about that. And we got our roots in consulting and service, so a significant portion of our business is helping organizations get off the ground, not necessarily with software. So without further ado, I'm going to get right into the presentation. So meet Sarah. Sarah is also known as Miss HR. So Sarah has been with Energy Central, and that's a company we're going to be talking about today, for about 8 years. This is her third company. She is the team lead, and she was specifically hired to focus on basically kickstarting or restarting this company's performance management process. So let's talk a little bit about Energy Central so you get a feel for the kind of context that Sarah had to work within as she was thinking about unfolding her processes in this new company. So Energy Central is it's an energy company. It's specifically an oil and gas company. They provide petroleum and natural gas exploration and extraction technologies and services. They're a public company. There are about 1,700 employees. The company is global, and as you can imagine, in this type of organization, their workforce is made up of both, what I would call white-collar professionals and blue-collar, so the petroleum engineers, the riggers, people of that sort who are going to be out in the field, and the field could be both, an oil field and or the ocean. Now, over the company's been around since the 70s. They've seen some tremendous growth, especially recently with the movement toward natural gas, and they've seen lots of expansion. Now, one of the issues that they're having, or one of the problems, is that they're struggling to retain their petroleum engineers and other oil and gas workers due to competitors coming out there and offering major salary hikes. There's tremendous amount of perks that are being offered, so it's very enticing for people with these skill sets that are very hard to find because they're very technical, require lots and lots of training, to be able to keep these people on when, some of those rewards look, pretty darn good from the perspective of the employee. Now, in this particular company, one of the changes that happened was that they recently hired a new chief human capital officer, that was their title, to help transform how the company manages its workforce. So there is a lot of change that is happening internally within this organization. And it's causing quite a bit of hiccups because many of the people who are at Energy Central have been there for 30 plus years. They've had a lifetime career. And at the same time, they've been recruiting heavily for kind of this next generation to come in and start filling some of the gaps that they've been seeing. And so we have a multi-general workforce, and as you can imagine and as you've experienced probably in your own organizations, they each require different things. And so having a performance management process has been quite tumultuous. But Sarah received feedback that one of the areas that needed a closer look was the performance management area. She had received lots of feedback from both the managers and the employees that it just seemed ineffective. It was a waste of time. You've probably heard these words before. So she was tasked to fix the appraisal process. Like many organizations, performance management was getting a bad rap. She started to question whether or not she wanted to use a rating scale or move to something that was more, I would say, feedback-centric. But she also wanted to make sure that whatever process she rolled forward with, that it wasn't going to complicate things. She wanted to keep it simple. She's always had that same philosophy. She's not, jump into the ocean with both feet. She likes to think about how to roll things out. So what we're going to do is take a look at how she really felt her process was summed up. It was a little bit antiquated. It didn't serve the needs not only of the next generation, but it wasn't doing a good job of serving her customer, the managers, the employees, because they felt that things were just getting junked in a trash bin. So let's take a look at what her current process looked like internally, so you have some context. So in Energy Central, their environment was using a paper-based model. When I looked at their performance plan, it literally looked like something that was downloaded off the internet. It was something similar to this. This isn't their exact one, but it was pretty darn close. So in their current program, they used two different templates, one that was manager-oriented and one that was an individual contributor-oriented. And they were really focused on what I would say top-down appraisal system. The managers were really the one driving the input. So there was no self-evaluation. It was just whatever your manager put on here, he sat with you or she sat with you and provided comments. The two areas assessed were the major responsibilities. And when I say major responsibilities, they kept it very high level. It wasn't role specific. So somebody, a rigger might be evaluated on the same responsibilities as somebody in marketing because they were very genericized, if you will. And then the other part of that being the behavior and capabilities. And the behavior really represented for them the values of their organization, and that pretty much was standard across the board. Pretty standard. The most sought-after rating scale is the 5-point rating scale. However, what you see here is it's really no definitions of what that rating scale means, and it wasn't even on the cover page. They used it solely for annual merit increases. So they had a means to an end, and this is how they did it. This is the first portion of the plan. The second portion occurred at exactly the same time, and we'll talk a little bit about timing shortly, as the appraisal, and the employee via email and or by writing on this, because they literally wrote on the performance plan, because there are people in the field who didn't have access to computers. So, the manager would distribute these hard copies, employees would write on these hard copies on the development side and then hand it back in, and then employee comments, manager comments were handwritten. Now, in the office, it was a little different. They were using Microsoft Word to be able to, do it a little bit more electronically, if you will. So, you can see they had this development plan, but really what this development plan was, it wasn't what I really would define as a development plan, and I'll talk about that earlier. It was basically a training plan based on the strengths and weaknesses that your manager rated you on in the former section. As you can see here, like most reviews, there is one section for manager and employee comments, and there was a sign-off process. So really focused on, or not really focused on, getting the data. But what I didn't see when I was looking at this is how does an employee and or a manager know really what they're working toward? Where's the insight in terms of what objectives they're meeting into, or what's the overall development or mission of the company, and how do they play into that? So it was a very limited snapshot of really what it's going to take to really measure performance. Their snapshot here is their program was very condensed. They did it on an annual cycle. So you can see it's condensed here in June, which was handled in Q2. Now, in our survey, if you want to figure out where you fit, we had about 240 companies register, and how this broke down, Q2, people who do evaluations in Q2 represent about 11% of all companies that responded, with the highest being in Q1, that represents 41%, and Q3 was 7%, Q4 20%, and anniversary was 21%. So you can see it's distributed across the board. But for the purposes of Energy Central, they launched their basic program email, or they handed these papers to the managers at the beginning of the month, around the 3rd-ish. They sent some reminders out, on the 10th. They expected managers to have these one-on-one meetings basically in 1 week, and was very difficult because some managers had many, many employees, with one more reminder email on the 25th, and the 28th it was due. So in the month of June, that's a lot of work for the managers to do. Not a lot of work on the employee because, as we said, this is a manager-driven performance cycle. So everybody goes through that cycle. The managers are giving feedback. Employees have a copy of the plan, and much like other organizations we've worked with, the performance review gets shelved. So employee really has no input into, what about my career and where am I going? There's not a lot of input for people other than those on a disciplinary plan, where they're getting a lot of attention. Their development plan's a lot more intense. It's being managed more regularly. So, employees felt that it was just a big waste of time having to sit through this when, there was really no follow-on throughout the year. So it's no wonder employees were frustrated, as well as managers frustrated in the process, because they're employees as well. So Sarah had to ask herself, how do we move away from the past? How do we drive change? How do we get away from these past procedures and move toward a solution that is going to make the employees a little bit more engaged and is going to give management what they needed? And after doing all of her research and distilling the feedback from all the stakeholders, and that's managers, employees, going through the complaints as well as the needs, there were really 5 areas that were driving this change. The first area being that it was very standalone and it was manual. The one time a year didn't seem to drive enough energy, especially for the younger generation, when these people are coming in and they're used to Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and all of these technologies that have been enabling them since they've been in 4th and 5th grade. So when they have that kind of environment where they're coming in and they're having to use paper, it is extremely frustrating, so much so that, they're leaving in a very short order. The overemphasis on the quantifiable metrics in the goal agreement. And what I really want to say about this is when you're, especially for the people who are in the field, they're saying, well, what kind of metrics do I really need to track? Are you tracking how long it takes me to dig a hole? Is that something that's measurable? So there had to be a lot of discussion about what gets measured, how do we measure it, how are goals different from people that are in the white collar versus the blue collar, and how often do we measure? Third, infrequent feedback and communication. There would be times where managers wouldn't talk to employees for months at a time because it was just inaccessible. That's sometimes a lot harder to overcome than, if you're in the office next door and there's still a lack of feedback. So that was one aspect. Again, going back to that younger generation, they want more feedback, and they don't want feedback just from their manager. They want feedback from their peers and from others that they're working with to have dialogue around goals, goal attainment, objectives, and objectives and attainment. In this particular organization, there wasn't a lot of focus on career development. Career development in this company really was a catalog of training that employees could sign up for if they wanted. And when we audited the training, it really wasn't career development so much as how to use Excel, how to do project management, things of that nature, which is really more training oriented to me. No visibility into how employees were performing against the goal, and we mentioned that earlier. Even on the current performance review, there was really no what am I going to achieve this month. So with that in mind, Sarah, had a team of people, and she's doing her research much like you are doing today to figure out what are the best practices for my organization with this, with this size organization in my industry, with this type of workforce dynamics. How am I going to put together a good process that's going to accommodate everybody, all of the stakeholders, and that's really hard to do. So the questions that she was really looking for fell into 4 areas. What should we measure during the performance process? How often should we measure performance? What's the best way to track goals? And how can we increase recognition and feedback? So these were the 4 areas of concern in her organization. So let's break down each of those questions in the rest of this presentation and take a closer look at how Sarah started to unfold and answer some of these questions. So when you think about, what do I measure? It's a very complicated question, and it's complicated because there are values and behaviors. People treat those things differently. There's job-based skills, for example, marketing versus sales versus engineer versus IT versus, lift fork operator. There are corporate objectives, team objectives, individual objectives, and sometimes when you're in a professional services organization, there are also project or service-related objectives that can span across multiple different departments and multiple different people and multiple different levels. So there can be lots of different types of objectives that get managed. Some organizations have just a self-appraisal, some have manager only, some have both. And then you have this knowledge asset, or IQ, or a lot of people call it a lot of different names, but how do we measure knowledge and track that knowledge so that our organization can continue growing forward? But it's not just these, and what you see is organizations measure one aspect, they measure 2, they measure 3, some measure all, but what people don't start to think about is what are the interactions of tying some or all of these different pieces together. What's right? What's wrong? How do we measure the intersection? And it really boils down to, I think, a simple concept. It's about organizational behavior. What type of organization am I in, and what will be supported in that type of organization? And I find that when I'm speaking with a lot of HR leaders, the ones that are accountable and responsible for selecting the right strategy and rolling it out and then managing it, don't take into consideration organizational behavior when designing their programs. And another word for the behavior could be organizational culture. So what we're going to talk a little bit about is how does organizational behavior impact how you do performance in your organization. So there was a study done, and this is one of my favorite studies, does organizational behavior affect performance? And it was out in the Professional Services Journal. And in that journal, which I think is very telling, they talk about 4 quadrants or 4 types of organizational behavior. And we're going to talk about what those 4 are. And in the competitive box, typically what that is representative of is a results-driven company. They're highly competitive, very goal-oriented. They're kind of unified by an emphasis on winning, on reputation, on success. About 10% of all companies fall into this category, and they tend to be more sales and product driven. So this is kind of just giving you a snapshot of of each of these organizations. Now, if you think about who you think in terms of organizations out there that fit into this box, who would you think? Well, the organizations that come to mind for us is Microsoft and Oracle, just to kind of give you a frame of reference of how we're categorizing these boxes. Secondly, controlled environment. So one that is more structured, formal. There tends to be an immense amount of power at the top. It's very top-down in terms of its style. Success really is all about dependable delivery, scheduling. Sometimes they can be the low-cost provider or the one who's focused on efficiency. Again, 10% are focused here, and their org strategy here is really about efficiency. On the creative front, well, and in the controlled, the organizations that tend to fall in that box would be Computer Associates and IBM. On the creative side, these organizations are more dynamic and entrepreneurial oriented. They tend to have very highly creative people within their organization who are doing a lot of disruptive work. They're really not afraid to take risks. Everything is very team oriented. About 20% are represented in this category, and they tend to focus on research and development. The examples here would be Apple and Google. And finally, we have the collaborative environment. These typically are very relationship-oriented environments. There's a lot of sharing and collaboration. It tends to be the friendliest of the cultures. There's a lot of emphasis placed on teamwork above and beyond individual participation. It's a lot of consensus management. And then they tend to really place a lot of emphasis on marketing and customer satisfaction. So like an HP and a network appliance would fit within this category. And this kind of environment seems to be the dominant type of culture within these four areas. Now, if we break it down a little bit more, when we start to think about the way that we measure performance, the two on the top, competitive and controlled, tend to be more focused organizations. They know exactly what they want and where they're going. Whereas on the creative and collaborative side, they tend to be a lot more flexible and bending. The other dynamics are on the competitive and creative side, they tend to be more externally driven based on market need or customer needs, whereas the controlled and collaborative tend to look a little bit more internal. And they're looking at operational efficiencies and how do you win through those sorts of gains. Now, when we're thinking about that whole measuring of performance, the top, competitive and controlled, are much more objective and quantitative, so getting to the numbers, and the bottom tend to be more subjective and qualitative. And then again, just the focus on the left side on competitive and creative is highly individual, and then controlled and collaborative are highly team-oriented. So when we think about this, and this is just a high-level summary, what are the implications for how performance management should work within my company? And one of the things first I want to mention before I move on to the next slide is, of course, typically within these environments, the culture and the personality is driven by the leaders, but those leaders tend to hire more leaders like themselves. So when you think of yourself as an HR leader, you have to also think about, if I was in a competitive environment and I had performance management a certain way, it's really important for you to think about the context of your current environment and not immediately, because of your experience and it was very successful in that other company, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should just adopt those practices and bring them in because they were successful in that environment. You really need to think about the environment that you're in and adapt the process that you learned for a different environment. And let's talk more about that. So before we go on, where does Energy Central fall? They fall on the collaborative side of this model. So very team-oriented. They're a little bit focused on the internal and then more on the qualitative. So the implications. So when we're thinking about performance, what are some of the outputs that are happening as a result? Well, there's lots of individual recognition. It's about those special employees in that competitive environment, the heroes. There tends to be a lot of popularity for the superstar. there's a lot of sink and swim approach. You're either going to make it or you're out. There's very little room for what I would call the middle players who are Bs. You either move up, or it doesn't work, kind of that Jack Welch approach. Lack of manager-employee feedback, because everybody's really just running because there's so much focus on the individual. There tends to be quite a bit of year-end surprises at review times. It's because expectations may not have been set in the right way. It's very specific in terms of its career development. A lot of it is upward advancement, and as the economy was hit over the past 10 years, even this type of organization is figuring out how do we avoid just that upward mentality and allow for more lateral career development. And then typically the output is damaged relationships due to trust from that performance between employee managers not wanting to do the reviews because they're not sure if they put something down if it's going to come back to haunt them because of the competitive nature. On the controlled side, it's a very disciplined approach. It's very process-centric. There tends to be a lot less emphasis on individual recognition. It's very directional in terms of appraisal and feedback, bringing you basically down. They focus on very specific training. So these are high training organizations. They tend to offer lots of mentorship, lots of really formalized training internally, huge organizational development organizations, because it's all about getting that process right. But what happens is when it's so focused and driven, although that's really awesome to be able to provide employees, sometimes they don't feel empowered because you're either in that model or not. On the creative side, appraisals are more haphazard. They're driven by team leaders. They tend to be able to make up their own appraisals. It's not really driven by the HR department. Some organizations are doing it, some are not. A lot of it is informal and not easily able to track, and from an HR perspective, that can be hard, especially when it comes time to either promoting or disciplining or whatever that may be. There's a lot of focus on cross-functional teams. They typically are the group that doesn't like the formal rating system, so they're more feedback-oriented, and it's a very cooperative environment. So, if you think about an advertising agency, for example, employees, even though they're in a role, they tend to switch teams based on the quality of accounts. So you go in, you might be new, and as you get more experience and get better, you get to take on the better accounts. So they might be in the same role, but the opportunity to learn is much broader. And then the collaborative side, again, Energy Central mirrored some of these. Individual contribution can suffer over team attainment. There's moderate manager and employee feedback, so it does happen, but it seems more of a check the box than getting together and really talking at length about being development oriented. They have a need to combine the formal with the informal more than anybody else because they are so relationship oriented. They tend to have and attract the personalities that are more sensitive, if you will, and they do tend to have either a strong focus on either moving up a very engineering type ladder and or a lot of lateral focus. Now, I'm not saying that these are all carved in stone, not at all, but what you need to think about is, and what we have found over time is we've tracked every single organization we've ever done a performance management initiative. We've kind of figured out what box do they fit in and what are the issues that are going on, so that over time we can start to see more and more trends for our companies and serve up best practices when we start to help them with their rollout plan. So we're tying that to the model that we showed, and then TalentGuard's research on what are we seeing internally from a rollout perspective. Now, based on that, so as Sarah started to dig down deep with her team, she's asking herself, well, if we fit in that collaborative box, and we're mirroring some of these similarities that we're finding here, what is it that we could do to roll out the best performance review program? So what we're going to talk about now are what components have we seen internally at TalentGuard work best in these different types of environments. And so within the competitive type of environment, the components of the performance review, and remember how we had that crazy slide earlier, that tend to get the least resistance and the most engagement are when they're measuring the corporate objectives, the individual objectives, they're doing an interim review and a year-end review. Those would be the 4 components in that environment that seem to be accepted by the different audiences. In the controlled environment, they're focused on having that kind of behavioral values assessment. They're focused on corporate, team, and individual objectives, so there's a lot of cascading within this type of environment. They tend to do quarterly reviews with the final year-end review. In a creative environment, it's mostly the values. They do a lot of individual development planning, and then the year-end review is really based on a little bit of job role and a little bit of objectives. So it's more soft in that sense. And then in Energy Central's case, we have a lot more. We have the behaviors and the values. We have really a heavy focus on the team objectives. We have job-based skills review, lots of interim planning, and then the year-end review. So for this context, we're going to stick within this collaborative environment. It would be too much for me to talk about all the different ones and how to roll those out appropriately. So we're going to stick with the collaborative. So now we ask the question, well, if those are the components of the review for this program, how should we measure and track performance process? And one of the things that Sarah did was not only do research and figure out, how often are people doing it and what is accepted. We've also tracked, again, at TalentGuard to figure out how are employees feeling based on the number of times that they're doing a review. So what we found was annually, employees feel that there is that true lack of engagement and less trust in the process. If it's done 4+ times a year, and we have some clients who do it every single month, employees were no more engaged than with biannually, but more frustrated over the administration of the process. So where we found the most acceptance was in the biannually, and it's where employees were doing basically a formal review, some informal check-ins, and then some type of interim. Now, where employee engagement increased, 2 conditions were met. One, when the employee was able to assess their manager at some point during the performance management process, and just a very basic assessment, and when regular career development discussions with managers were being held throughout the year. So those do impact how employees feel based on time. So Sarah designed a process that really brought together performance and fostered engagement. Now, as we said earlier with that picture of the calendar, Sarah, their entire process was in June. So you can see that there. It's up in June. It's the old process. So there's really not a lot happening throughout the year other than them doing their work. Now, it would be easy to say, let's just run out and start everything from the beginning based on all of the components that she wanted to include, but it's just not feasible and it's not realistic, because with each change that Sarah made internally to her organization, it requires a tremendous amount of change management and a tremendous amount of training of the managers and the employees. So it really is a shift in the culture, and you have to manage it as such. So for her quote-unquote year 2, which was her real year 1, what she tended to focus on, what we identified would be the best thing for the organization, was that in July, which was the start of their year, we were going to focus on establishing corporate objectives and cascade them down. And then we were going to revisit those in November and in March, where we were going to do the interim. That was really, so you can see here in the blue, it's really an objectives focus to get started. Now, we knew that engagement would increase if we at least introduced a career development discussion. And we decided that because this objectives would take such a long time to get people on the system, getting cascaded appropriately, getting people learning how to track, and doing that first check-in, the first career development discussion would be most beneficial after that was done. So in December, when things started to slow down a little bit for them. And you can see here the orange really focuses on career. So what I'm going to do for this process, so that I can just give you the full view, is we're going to focus on what her year 3 process looked like. So we talked a little bit about the objectives focus. As she went into year 3, she kicked off much more formal career development discussions in August, where we were truly moving it from, basically a training plan to a full-up career plan. So we've got the career focus happening in August, December, and April. We've got the objectives happening in July, November, and March. And then if you notice these white, this is the feedback all year long. And it was different, as I said, for white collar versus blue collar. And then we also have check-ins with HR. So there's a lot of stuff that has to happen with HR. We're going to talk about that momentarily. But before I do, I want to talk a little bit about goals, because I think it's extremely important to think about this when you are rolling out that performance management process. And it's really about business attainment versus realizing dreams. Now, most organizations tend to spend more time on business attainment. They're the shorter metrics and KPIs. The development plans, as I said, are mostly focused on that. And although we give a lot of weight toward career and personal goals, I rarely see that being supported internally within the organization. Now, what we're saying is, okay, you're responsible for your career, and we might give you some tools, but that really isn't long-term career planning. When we're thinking about career and personal goals, it's about career pathing, how do I move around in the organization, and personal growth. And we're going to break each of these down. But assuming that we can bring both of those together, and it does need to have a balance, and this is one of the things that I think is broken across a lot of organizations. So if we're able to focus on that attainment and ignite those dreams, we're going to have a much higher career engagement. And with higher career engagement, we're going to have a lot more retention. And why is that? The objectives focus. Business attainment is all about what the leaders want, right? So the ultimate goal when you're thinking about your performance process is, if I'm going to manage and track objectives, in what form and in what method and in what way am I going to need to bring the organization together to see whether or not we are on track as an organization, as a business unit, as a team, and as an individual. And you have to be able to present information in a way that your leadership team, your CEO, is going to be able to consume that information. Not only that, it's fruitless to track objectives if it's not going to be supported by the CEO. And within this organization, it was supported. It was being requested, and HR was spending a lot of time with the managers trying to pull together all kinds of paper-based reports to get something so that we could all look at. So something like this you need to serve up. And when you serve that up and you set objectives, as you know, it's really hard to track via paper. And so if you're going to track objectives, there is no reason why in this day and age you shouldn't automate it, whether it's through some automated tool that you've created in-house, some metrics that you put in within some type of Excel spreadsheet that gathers everybody's information, and I've seen that done, or a third-party tool. You have to be able to express and share goals in a very transparent way. And if you don't share them in a transparent way, it's very difficult to get people to want to update them. So again, clearly defined goals so that executives, managers, and employees can see what's going on at any given time, up, down, and across the organization. And in this case, what we're showing you here is increased revenue by $1 million. How many people are tied to that goal, as an example, and are we on track or not on track? And if we look at Frank, for example, over here, and we see 40%, as a manager, it's my job to start what am I doing? Performance management. I need to understand why Frank seems to be so off track and not keeping up with his peers. And this is a manager's dashboard, so employees wouldn't naturally see how he's doing against his peer. So if you're going to drill down into the goal, and remember, one of the issues was feedback. So how can I, as a manager who's not going to see my employee constantly, drill down layers deep and start to figure out and ask questions about what's going on, track the dialogue, invite other people to give me feedback on what Frank may or may not be doing, or have Frank invite people to give feedback, and have a mechanism where it's all contained in one area, and you're not looking after multiple documents and a PIP plan and a performance plan and email and all of those other things where it's not feasible to see what's going on from a performance perspective. In addition to that, it's a number one trend and a number one thing that employees start to think about is, how can I get feedback that's beyond my manager? How can I get feedback from peers? How can I get feedback from people maybe external to the company, a customer that I'm working on, or a vendor or a supplier, but do it, what I'm going to say, in a more confidential way. So the way that we think about feedback so that it protects the organization and it protects the employee is, the employee should be the one who solicits feedback. You shouldn't. Our theory is you shouldn't just leave it open for anybody to comment on it at will. We want it to be relevant. We want it to be specific, and we want it to be managed in that way. But what it also does for the manager is, what we're trying to do throughout the process of managing this stuff year-round is getting away from the halo effect, or getting away from the relevancy effect, where I'm going to do the review right now, and because you screwed up last week, your review's not going to be so good. It gives us a reminder as we go back and we start to look at this individual employee, and I'm thinking, oh wow, I might be too hard on this person, or maybe I'm not looking at it in the right way. It really helps level that playing field. Now, having this type of tracking was a lot more difficult in the field, and even though they did have wireless, there was not a lot of computers out there, so the way that they handled it was by having iPads, or in the actual manufacturing facilities they had kiosks. So there were ways, but the expectations were set at a different level. Now, from an HR perspective, and as well as a manager perspective, there are different types of goals that need to be managed. And if it's a performance goal, or a career goal, or a personal goal, or a disciplinary goal, we have to allow employees to be able to track those so that we know I would never include career and personal goals as part of a performance review. But I would definitely include performance and disciplinary. But what we don't want to do is not enable employees to track those other goals, because we want to be able to serve up development options based on what they're working on or what we recommended they focus on, and again, allow that level of feedback. So it's not a system where we're penalizing people, but it truly is a system of development. So if we focus from talking a lot about the objectives, and these colors mirror that circular process, and now focus on the career, what does it mean when we're talking about those career goals? Well, employees by nature are going to think about themselves. They're asking the questions, where am I going in this company? What can I do with my career? How am I going to be empowered to learn and grow within this company? What can I do? And it's very seldom that an organization will serve up that information. And that is the number one thing, career development, that employees always ask for, but it's not delivered upon in a high quality way. We provide training, and training is not career development. The question that employees want answered as they're going through this performance management and talent management process is, what do I want to do with my career? And it's either going to be with your organization, or it's going to be with some other organization. And what they're really looking to answer is, what's available for me? So in this case, if Jill is the IT service designer and she wants to see what's available, they want to be able to go in and, for example, say, well, what if I want to be an IT design manager? What kind of fit am I? What if I want to be an IT project manager? Again, What kind of fit am I? What gaps am I missing? How long is it going to take? What type of resources are available to help me close that gap? And they might want to manage multiple types of these things. They might want to look within their department, across their department, true career mobility. So how do you enable that within your organization is key to, again, bringing together those business attainment and those more self-motivated goals. And what a manager needs to be able to see, because an employee is going to ask during those career development discussions, and again, remember we held these in December and April, hey, I'm interested in this role based on my profile and based on these assessments, and these are really driven by the performance review in 360 and what they fill out and what the manager has endorsed. This is where I'd like to go. So can you help me get there? What kind of plan may I put in place? And the reason why, well, the reason why our rationale for serving it up more as a career lattice is this is an organization who valued lateral moves and who also valued downward moves because they had a huge baby boomer population and they didn't want to force people out of the organization at a certain age, but they did want to allow them to find opportunities where they could decelerate their career, and what that means to us, decelerate is not have to work, 70 hours a week, but maybe 30 hours a week in a role that they can add that knowledge, if knowledge is something that you value. So making it easy for the employee to really be engaged in your organization and not, like I said, not just about the performance, but about what they're looking for and bridging those two gaps together makes for an ideal situation. And again, as I'm just showing you, you already saw this picture, but in this category it was career, and we're really placing a lot of emphasis on let me show you how to close the gap. And it's HR's organization to determine what those competencies are, and if you have an LMS, what within your LMS will close the gap, and or working with a third party to help you figure out what closed the gap. But if you're putting a performance review together and you're expecting employees to go out there and figure out how to close the gap, especially if it's a PIT plan, it's never going to happen. They need more direction than that. So if you're able to streamline that process by working it out beforehand, you're really going to save yourself a lot of time and a lot of frustration. Now, if we move to the appraisal focus, what we start to look at is, remember, we kicked that off in October, and the first one was all about remember we said the behaviors and the values, but what Sarah also enabled at this particular time in October was that you were able to assess your manager at this point, and it was very, very basic, 3 questions. And they decided to do it as a self-assessment because they didn't want to overburden the manager, but it was always an option. But her option was not to. She really wanted it to be about what the employee thought about how they fit and what they really thought about their manager. So, we did have that two-way dialogue. And then in February and June, as we said, they really focused on the job role, so what was required of an IT analyst, and then the objectives. So, we did it in February, and then again in June was the formal. So February was basically the interim, and then June was the formal, and that was year-end wrap, and then they would start that calendar over again. And when you think about objectives, and when you start getting into a program, some of those objectives are going to transfer over to the next year for a myriad of reasons, and then some of them are going to be new. But once you get the process rolling, that third year really starts to feel nice. That first year is very painful. You're going to have lots of resistance. It's going to be, feeling like, you're really forcing people to go through the change. The second year, people are much more comfortable with it. They're getting there. Things are much more understood. But the third year is really when you're going to feel the real process in effect at its peak, and then you can grow it and tweak it from there. So I want to go back to this slide for a minute and say it doesn't close out with just that, because HR are the facilitators of the process, and year-round you're going to be training and sending reminders and doing reporting and focusing on the metrics, and we can't not afford to push this to the side because it's equally as important. And I really call it the strategic facilitator, because you're able to get into that dashboard and really drive change in your organization. You're going to be the one who not only figures out where are people, how do I need to move the needle, who's done, as people are completing, how can I pull up these metrics as my manager is asking me where people are. And you're going to be asked for all kinds of information if you're not already, and you know how painful that is. When somebody says, well, what do we look like across the board with our talent? So you want to be able to show your performance distribution, who's above the mean, within the mean, and over the mean. And you're going to be asked to pull it by department, by role, by geography, by goal. You're going to be asked across the board based on all the performance reviews. Are we as an organization lacking? Is there a trend that we're lacking in any competency? Meaning, are people getting dinged in the same competency? If so, how can we make an organizational initiative to move that forward, especially if it's instrumental to the business? Is any one department doing better than the other? Where are my ratings falling? How is this impacting us here and then globally? How does it transfer? And at any given point, how are we doing in our goals? I don't understand in this day and age how organizations can operate without this information, because it's absolutely essential to drive change and incremental improvements internally, to know where you are and then to know where you're going and how you have to tweak it to move forward. So having said that, I want to kind of come back to that question, the final question. How can we increase feedback internally within the organization? And in a lot of organizations that I've been in, and I've done a tremendous amount of coaching before starting TalentGuard, and the number one feeling of employees is they always feel they're out there alone, sitting in a desert, working. They're the only one there. Nobody else is around them. Feedback isn't coming in. It doesn't feel two-way. It's very isolated. So we need to move the needle. And the only way that an organization can move the needle is through training. And it's really about the managers having adequate training to be able to perform their job. So what knowledge and skills must managers have to be effective in managing performance? Well, it's not about when managers become first-time managers or we hire new managers in, about that manager one-on-one training. That is the first level of training that managers have. The second level of training that you need to provide on an ongoing basis and update people regularly, because you have new employees coming in, is your organizational development team needs to put together a training agenda that covers all areas of performance. And you can read through these. I'm not going to touch on all of them because I'd bore you to death, but you got to focus on what is the rating scale, for example. Why do we have the rating scale? What does it mean? What does it look like of people in examples of each of the rating scales? What do they look like and not look like? And the reason why you want to do this is you want to start to get people on the same page. We want to move people away from rating everybody the same way. So the sameness effect. We want to move those managers from being extremely uncomfortable with giving people feedback and then supporting that with those one-on-one discussions to giving them the confidence and the tools to be able to express why employees rated the way they are. And what that really boils down to is that manager understanding that employee's role. Now, where I see performance reviews going off the haywire, where employees get very upset, is they were hired for a role and they are no longer being evaluated for that role because there was such job creep on that role that it was almost impossible to rate them because there were so many more things on other than what the employee really was being evaluated on. So if an employee is in a role and you've defined certain role responsibilities, it is important to make sure that manager is truly evaluating what's on that role, not what's way above and beyond it. So they have to have a firm grasp of your job structure and what it means in that job structure. So having a clean job family structure is important. What makes this hard to do performance management is when you have 15 or 16 different definitions of project manager. So that's an area that you would need to clean up. So, these are some examples, how to document good and bad, that each one of these is a training class in and of itself. So if you don't have anything like this, or if it's not as comprehensive as this, please think about how you can improve that within your organization, because if we can get managers trained the right way, they're going to train the employees the right way, and there'll be more of a cascading effect. Now, when I showed you the slide that had kind of the dashboard of are we on or are we off, what's really amazing when you move through a process like this, you know what you're doing, you automate it, you've spent the time, you've had the feedback. It's amazing from an employee's perspective to be able to click with one button and the manager and be able to print their career dossier. Now, what that means is, based on all those tabs that you saw, they can now with one click print their values and behaviors assessment, all of the year-end interim and year-end review, and the feedback and the data, their job-based assessment with the feedback and the data, all of the objectives, and then their individual development plan, sit down with their manager and have a rich, lush discussion about all of the exchanges. In addition to that, being able to, people like to show and tell within your dossier, seeing what documents you've uploaded and saved for your manager to take a look at because you're proud of them. That saves hundreds of hours in time per cycle for the stakeholders, which is manager, employee, HR, and manager's manager. So that adds a lot of value, and that's something that's just impossible to do today if you're not thinking about that engagement. And what we're all striving for, right, is if we put the right training in place, we have the right process, we've automated the right way, and HR is facilitating it in the way that works within their organizational design, we are going to be able to drive the right feedback, recognize employees in an appropriate fashion at an appropriate time and not just once a year. We can truly track performance, and then we're having highly engaging career discussions so that we can get to the point where employees really feel good about their job. You're the employer of choice. We're making strong recommendations to other employees to stay, and you're providing something that nobody else is. And with that, that's how I'm concluding this particular webinar. Just a couple of notes, and I'll open it up to Q&A. We have two webinars coming up, one on February 18th, which is Beyond the CEO, Implementing Holistic Succession Planning for the Entire Organization, and then Career Pathing Focus, Retaining Millennials, How Do You Cultivate the Next Generation Through Career Pathing. We'll also be able to, if you want to, get a demo. In this particular presentation, we spent most of the time talking about performance, and you've seen some of those screenshots, but we do have a full suite that you can go to the website and learn a little bit more about. So with that, what I'd like to do is see if we have any questions, and it will take me a minute to just open up the box here. And I might have to pull it forward because it's a little small. Let me grow up this screen. Okay, so I'm just going to stand up here for a minute because I need to read these questions. So the first question from a Michael Hughes is, the oil and gas industry has the additional pressure of booms and busts in the industry. There are entire decades where no new latent talent is added to the pool. That's exactly right, Michael, and hence the reason for retention. So when you have people that are in organizations and the organization is not moving, a heavier emphasis starts to get placed on lateral mobility within the organization. And employees, it's not just, and I tell this to people all the time, it's not just about rising up the ladder. It's about moving across the ladder and being able to try out different roles and gain new skills and get involved in different projects. But here's the problem. If employees don't understand their own skill set, which most don't, if managers don't understand the skill set the employees have and where they've been before, And if they have no way to look at the roles across the company, they just feel defeated and take no action. Next one is from Valerie. Should biannual reviews have been semi-annual reviews? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Valerie, they absolutely are. Yes, semi-annual. So thank you for that. That was a mistake. Is there fear of rating managers? Is there anonymity, which I would think would be vital? You can absolutely, and that's how we did this assessment on when we were talking about the values and behaviors in that October time frame. We did do that as an anonymous assessment to get that feedback, hence why we didn't include the manager, because we did it more as a 360. And so, Kenneth, I like the 4 quadrants, but I hope we could ultimately become somewhat competitive, creative, and collaborative to achieve our goals. Do you see the org behavior affecting the PM process, or can the PM process, if managed well, actually drive org change? Excellent question, Kenneth, and I do believe that once you start educating people on the dynamics of what it means to be in that organization, it's really about, first and foremost, the types of people that you hire. So if you're in a creative and you feel that you might be losing market share or moving or losing ground, you know, and you see this a lot, you might be hiring in a new CEO or a new leader or a new chief people officer to help hire those sorts of people. But what you have to realize is as you're going through that transition, you're going to have people that are going to come in and be those strong change agents while you have people that are still the same. So in the short term, as you're going through that change, you're going to have a disruptive process that you have to think about how to bring those two together. And you're probably going to have to run more like a parallel talent management group. So reviews, another one for Michael. So reviews only seem, what does that say? The original job description. What about the extra roles they are currently responsible for? Well, if they're currently responsible for something else, you need to think about 2 things. Expanding the role so it becomes the new standard. And that's happened a lot within organizations. Although what happens is they go, you have all this responsibility, but they've never expanded the role. Because what we want to do, right, is we want to keep that salary grade in the same place. We don't want to spend time updating it. It becomes too much of a process. But that causes havoc in the organization long term because it's really hard to manage. If you're expanding the role, expand the role. It doesn't necessarily have to come with more money or more rewards, but if it doesn't, then there's also that chance that you're going to lose that employee. Because if you're overloading them and there's nothing else, then, you know, are you really doing the right ethical thing as a company? Or are you just trying to get away with things? So I would throw it back on you. So I know there's a lot more questions, but I know that y'all have time commitment, and I don't want to run over any more. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Personally, you can send us an email at info@talentguard.com. And in addition to that, as I said, this is going to wrap up. We'll have it available for download, so you can go at your leisure or you know, shift through the slides that didn't have value for you. But as we sign out, I hope you take a minute to provide us with feedback. It's really important. We try to strike a good balance of best practices. You know, we always have an emphasis on automation because that's just who we are. And your comments are welcome. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful week, and I look forward to your next visit with us in February.